Yeah, I feel like there's such different people that would be here today in different places in their journey and their relationship with God, from those that were tricked into being here. Like, you didn't know that this is where you were going. Like, you thought you were being invited out for breakfast or brunch or something. And it's like, what are we doing at that crummy-looking building on the outside, but amazing on the inside? Or maybe this is just something that you felt prompted to attend. And then there'd be others for whom this is a habit and it's part of your custom. And then I also think that there'd be people, and I imagine that there'd be a few people that could relate to this. I know I have experienced this personally, where there's just such a yearning. There's like an ache of, I need something. Like, I need a word of encouragement. I need to be reassured that God is real, or I need to be reassured that there is hope, or I need to be reassured that He does love me, and all this stuff that we sing about and that they hear about and talk about, that it's not just hype, that it's real. And I just have the sense that no matter where you are in your journey, no matter where you find yourself in your belief about God or your experience with God, our hope and our prayer is that He would meet you where you are. And I think that's what He does out of His kindness. I think God, in His kindness, meets us where we are when we're ready. So I also have to just warn you that sometimes we're not ready to receive what we would like to receive, or what we're wanting. He's kind. He knows the right time. But I just want to encourage you, wherever you are in that journey, God sees you. God cares about you. And I feel like this is such a cliche. And I'm hoping that maybe something will shift for you in this regard today. But to also say that God loves you. Like, it sounds so trivial. It sounds so trite. But Easter, the Easter story, is so significant to followers of Jesus because it is such a significant example of His love. So it wasn't just, like, He didn't just write a love song, everybody. He didn't write a nice poem. He didn't send a greeting card. He didn't send flowers. Jesus literally died in our place. He took what we deserved, the wrath, the consequences, the sin. He took it on Himself so that we could have the relationship with God that He has enjoyed. What I'm trying to say is that He showed His love. Like, this isn't just talk. This isn't just hype. It's one thing to be romantic and to be all gooey, which is great. But how many of you know that when you grow in relationship with family or in a marriage, or whatever the case is, like, that love, it might not have all the same emotions attached every day, but there's a deepening that takes place when you grow in that commitment, in that covenant. I'm just saying, God has shown that love to us through His commitment. I want to go back to a story that Jesus told, a parable that is well known by many people, even those that are not familiar with church or the Bible. And if you were here on Friday, I'm going to ask you just to bear with me as I recap and repeat a little bit. I'm not going to be doing the second half. On Friday, we took a look at the story of the prodigal son, or what others have called the two sons, or Timothy Keller wrote a book called The Prodigal God, because actually he argued that the word prodigal means reckless, and actually it's the love of God that is reckless. Even though, yes, the idea of saying that the youngest son was reckless is true. So different people have called this story different names, but it's found in the book of Luke, chapter 15. And just to give you some background, this is Jesus telling three stories. This is the third of His stories that He's telling to a bunch of very moral, very righteous, very upright, very diligent, very strict religious people. They were offended by how loving and accepting He was of people that were not upright, moral, religious, self-righteous, etc. And that's not to say that He condoned stuff, or that He justified stuff or excused stuff. It's just that He still loved them anyway. And people that weren't anything like Jesus actually felt safe with Jesus and felt comfortable with Jesus and felt drawn to Jesus. And so because this was offending these religious leaders, He tells them three stories. The first is a story of a lost sheep, and how the shepherd will leave the 99 to go and find the one. And then there's a celebration with his friends, and he says, this is what it's like in heaven every time one person comes back to the Father. Second story is that of a lady with 10 silver coins, and how she loses one and turns the house upside down finding that coin. And when she finds it, she calls her neighbors together and has a party. And again, he says, this is what it's like in heaven when one person returns to God. Then he tells the story that I want to just touch on today, and it'll be a lot more brief than on Friday, because I do want to focus on the Father's love and what it says to us about the Father. So bear with me. You can follow along on the screen. Luke chapter 15, verse 11. It says, to illustrate the point further, so to illustrate the heart of our Heavenly Father, the love of our Father to people that are far from Him, that are close to Him, that don't even know that they're far from Him. To illustrate the point further, Jesus told them this story. A man had 2 sons. The youngest son told his father, I want my share of your estate now before you die. So his father agreed to divide his wealth between his sons. Now, we read that and it's like, okay, it sounds a little bit spoiled. It's a little bit hectic, but it's not the end of the world. It is almost impossible for us to fully grasp how offensive this would have been in the Middle Eastern culture 2,000 years ago. It was for all intents and purposes. This younger son was saying, I'm done with you. I want you dead. I want my inheritance now. So he was making it clear that he didn't want the father. He wanted the father's things. This would have been deeply offensive. Many of us have grown up in what some sociologists call a weak culture. Western cultures are generally very weak cultures. Others of us have grown up in what sociologists would call, or anthropologists would call, strong cultures, where there's a sense of community, there's a sense of family, there's a sense of heritage, there's a sense of togetherness. Western culture is very individualistic. So for us to think, well, the son's rude, just whatever, like cut him off if you have to. It's hard for us to appreciate how offensive this would have been to Jesus' listeners. They would have been like waiting for what next? Because they would have expected, just to be clear, they would have expected the father to drive the son out of the family home and the community with physical blows. So for them to hear him say that the father gave him his inheritance and let him go is like scandalous. They're buffered. They're like, wait, what? It just does not make sense. The story goes on, verse 13, a few days later, the younger son packed all his belongings and moved to a distant land, and there he wasted all his money in wild living. In other words, he had a good time, all right? It was fun. He went to Vegas. He did everything he wanted to do in Vegas. He had a good time. However, verse 14, about the time his money ran out, a great famine swept over the land, and he began to starve. He persuaded a local farmer to hire him, and the man sent him into his fields to feed the pigs. I want you to remember, this is a Jewish young man. The only job he could get is to feed pigs. It doesn't get lower for him. The young man became so hungry that even the pods he was feeding the pigs looked good to him, but no one would give him anything. And as I mentioned on Friday, the religious leaders are like, okay, all right, Jesus, we agree. He's an idiot. The father kind of allowed him to learn for himself, and now he's getting what he deserves. This is justice. Wonderful. We agree. Jesus is a bit cheeky, actually. And he's a master storyteller. By the way, from next Sunday, we are doing a series on the parables of Jesus. This is a parable of Jesus. We're doing a series on the parables of Jesus because he was masterful at drawing people in and then, kind of punching you in the gut, but in the best way possible. It's kind of like, the knife of an attacker versus the knife of a surgeon. Like it's like, oh, okay, thank you. Like it makes sense. Okay, I see now. It's like a bit painful, but it's like a lack of painful when you actually see, okay, I think I'm seeing now. Anyway, verse 17, he messes with them some more. He says, this youngest son, this rebel son, this son who wished his father dead, who said, I want your things, not you. Verse 17, when he finally came to his senses, he said to himself, at home even the hired servants have enough food to spare. And here I am dying of hunger. I will go home to my father and say, Father, I have sinned against both heaven and you, and I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Please take me on as a hired servant. So he returned home to his father, and while he was still a long way off, remember, I'm trying to paint a picture of the father's heart, the heart of the father. Jesus is trying to, there was one key point that he was trying to communicate to people. It's the heart of the father. While he was still a long way off, his father saw him coming. And then filled with love and compassion, he ran to his son, embraced him. Some have described that term meaning to like fall on him. Like he embraced him, he hugged him and kissed him. The son said to him, I have sinned against both heaven and you, and I'm no longer worthy of being called your son. But notice how the father's not listening. He's not agreeing. He's not correcting. He's not waiting for the son to grovel, to pay off, to somehow to unveil his master plan of how he's going to repay his father the gross dishonor, the material loss, because the father would have had to literally divide his everything he owned, his estate, into three parts, and had to give a third to him. He's not waiting for him to explain any of this while he is apologizing. Verse 22, but his father said to the servants, quick, bring the finest robe in the house and put it on him. Just so you know, the finest robe in the house would have belonged to the father. Think about that for a moment. Get a ring for his finger, which signifies identity. No, you walked away from the family, but you're back in the family. No, I'm not going to take you on as a slave. No, I'm not going to take you on as a servant. You're my son. Welcome home. Here's your signet ring and sandals for his feet. And kill the calf we have been fattening. Just so you know, that wasn't normal. That wasn't like Sunday lunch for them. It would have been extraordinarily rare. This was not normal. Even for wealthy people, to kill a calf that they've been fattening would have been the most outrageous of feasts, of celebrations. He's not allowing the son to kind of like eke in on his belly through the back door. He's like, we're going to celebrate. We must celebrate with a feast, for this son of mine was dead and has now returned to life. He was lost, but now he is found. And I love these words. So the party began. The party began. I know, I'm under no illusion that some, maybe even many of you sitting here, would find that either hard to believe or just whatever. But I am convinced that if you ever made that decision to turn to God, you started a party in heaven. If you've never made that decision and you make that decision today, tomorrow, next week, next month, you start a party in heaven. The party began. He doesn't shame the son. He celebrates the son. He doesn't water down anything that the son has done. He just welcomes him back. Jesus was trying to paint a picture of the Father's love. And I think even the fact that he was communicating these stories to these religious leaders who he knew, many of whom would be involved in having him murdered just a short while later, I think he was trying, even then, in his grace and compassion, I think he was trying to reach out to them, trying to get them to see the Father's love. A couple of ideas, just three. The Father's love is reckless and radical. It can even be offensive. And if it's not offensive, if it's never been offensive to you about you, maybe it's been offensive to you about the love that he's shown towards someone else. And when I say offensive to you, it could be that you might still be stuck in the idea that somehow you have to deserve it, that somehow you have to earn it. And I get that. That is human nature. I have battled with that to some extent for much of my life. And I've had to remind myself again and again, and then go beyond that to where it's not just an intellectual statement or hope, but where I've had to slow down in the way I spend time with God and allow God to, in a supernatural way, I believe, gently reassure me that there really is nothing I can do to make him love me more. That there really is nothing I can do to make him love me less. I can please him more, I can please him less, but he can't love me more. He can't love me less. And so what that does in me, in those moments, in those brief moments where that becomes more real, it motivates me to want to respond. It motivates me to want to follow, to want to trust, to want to obey. I think that's what Tammy was trying to say a few moments ago with the offering. It's in the sense of, like, there's a gratitude. We don't do stuff out of obligation or earning. We're doing stuff out of gratitude and responding to what has already been done. It is reckless. And yes, that does mean it can be abused. And I would imagine that any one of us that have actually tried to follow God have probably on some level or another abused or misused that love. And so it's reckless. It's reckless. Now, his love doesn't mean that he validates all kinds of garbage and allows, or he's happy with us to do whatever we want to do. But what it means is the moment, guys, please see this picture. This father ran to the repentant son. And I believe that he runs to the, like metaphorically speaking, he runs to the repentant. He doesn't need convincing. He doesn't need cajoling. He doesn't need to be manipulated by how sincerely we look, so sorry. Like, I am a wordy person, as some of you that have been around for a while know. So for me, I would want to be able to grovel verbally, to feel like I've owned enough what I need to own, and I've, self-flagellated enough to kind of like maybe when God's convinced that I feel bad enough and ashamed, and then maybe He will. And the truth is, I don't always know my heart, but I can tell you that when my heart is repentant, He runs to the repentant. And again, many of you would struggle to appreciate how significant it is that the father ran. The patriarchs of the families did not run, ever. Boys ran. If they didn't have much self-esteem, young men might run. But fathers never ran. He would have had to tuck his robes in a little bit to run to the son. It would have been a powerful picture to these religious leaders that were listening to him. Secondly, the Father's love is free, but it's not cheap, which again messes with our heads because it is completely free. And so again, when something's free, we tend to value it a little bit less. And we've seen that in human nature, and even over the years with people. Like, if you add a little value to it, people tend to value it more. I remember years ago, we were just trying to connect people in the community, and so our church was running for about a year in the Paddock Shopping Center, and we were then running a little program on Saturday mornings. I think, did we call it Kids Care? Kids Play. Some of you might have even been involved in that. And basically the idea was to just look after your child for half an hour, however long you want, while you go and do your shopping or go to Mug and Bean, whatever the case is. Yes, people took advantage of it. But that's not the point. The point, and the only goal for us was just to have any opportunity to connect with people. But what we discovered very quickly is if it's free, people are like they side-eye you. It's like, no thanks. Like naturally we want to place a value on something. So I think people are tempted to think, well, if it was free, then maybe it's cheap. I think this side of eternity, it's impossible for us to fully grasp how much it cost Jesus. It wasn't an accident. Nobody took his life away from him. He could call down thousands of angels in a split second and he would have been rescued and delivered. It wasn't done to him. He was part of the planning committee. He laid his life down. And if you were here a few nights ago, as we were just celebrating Holy Week, we spoke briefly about just how the unshockable Son of God was shocked in the Garden of Gethsemane an hour or two or a few minutes before he was arrested at this idea as it started to dawn on him that for the first time ever he's going to be separated from the Father, from the Holy Spirit, that he's going to have to take on the wrath of mankind. There's some of the language used in the original texts speaks of almost like a type of nausea coming up. It was so overwhelming. Not the idea of the physical suffering, the idea of having to take on the wrath that we deserved. And he staggered. If you know the story, he prayed not once, not twice, 3 times, Father, if there's another way, please take this cup. This cup means the wrath that I'm about to experience. Take this cup away from me. But then the famous words, not my will, but yours be done. So please don't think it was easy. Please don't think it was cheap. It cost him everything. And you might think, well, like on a human level, okay, for the father to do that to his son, he didn't. Clearly you haven't had kids. Or if you think it's easy, there's a problem in your relationship with your children, by the way. But it's not the same. Like we cannot compare this familial relationship. It cost him everything. everything. And the only reason was love. That he actually cared more about people, past and present and future, than his own trauma and suffering and demise. And yet it is free, which is why I think it is a little, like, I would imagine that it could be a little bit offensive to the Father whenever maybe it doesn't find it offensive, maybe it just finds it humorous, when we think that we can add something to the cross. When we, and of course we don't think like that consciously, but subconsciously, if we think that somehow we have to convince him to love us and forgive us, and only if we grovel enough and somehow pay off our debt enough, and if I serve at the church long enough and hard enough, and I give enough money, and I do all the things that they tell me I have to do, then maybe I'll be acceptable. I think the Father would be like, do you really think any of that can be added to what Jesus did at the cross? Yes, it's free, but it's not cheap. And lastly, the Father's love changes us. The longer I live, the longer I follow God with valleys and peaks, with failures and successes, with trying hard to do a lot of stuff in my own strength and trying to figure out what it means to surrender and to trust and obey, I think the single most liberating idea that is continuing to grow in me is this idea of the order of things. It's not us becoming lovable that then makes him love us. It's him loving us that makes us lovable. And that love changes us. You cannot see the grace of God for what it is and stay exactly the same. Not have some kind of gratitude eventually stirred up. Not have some desire to want to worship him, to want to respond, to want to care about what he cares about, which is people. Long term, his love changes us. Maybe you've heard the story before. I'd be very impressed if you've ever watched this movie, but there was a movie that came out years ago. I haven't watched it. I've heard about it. Called 3 Seasons. It was an acclaimed foreign film about life in post-war Vietnam. And it tells the story of 2 people. Hai is a gentleman who is a rickshaw driver, and Lan is a lady who at this stage of her life is working as a prostitute. She's a beautiful lady that is a prostitute. They both have deeply unfulfilled desires. For Hai, it's the fact that she's in love with Lan, but she's out of his price range. For Lan, she lives in grinding poverty, even though she gets to spend some time in some of the nicest hotels in the area, but never gets to spend the night. She hopes that prostitution, or the money that she earns from prostitution, will be her means of escape, but instead the work brutalizes and enslaves her. And if you have a healthy level of self-awareness, you, I imagine, can relate to things in your life that you have looked to bring you freedom or healing, and how it's actually caused a deeper level of enslavement and feeling brutalized by this addiction or this reliance. Hai enters a rickshaw race and wins top prize, and with the money that he wins, he brings Lan to the hotel. Now, everybody watching the movie or reading the story assumes that there's an agenda. And he does have an agenda, but it's not what people would imagine. Instead of using the power of his wealth to have sex with her, he actually spends it to purchase a place for her for one night in the normal world to fulfill her desire to belong. In other words, he paid for the room, for the night, just to let her sleep. Now, some of you can imagine, Lan finds such grace deeply troubling at first. If you've only ever been used and abused, your assumption is going to be like, what's the agenda, right? When's the other shoe going to fall to the ground? And over time, it becomes apparent that he is using his power to serve rather to use her, and it begins to transform her, making it impossible for her to return to a life of prostitution. And in very much the same way, Jesus had all the power in the world, and he saw us enslaved by the very things that we thought would free us, and he paid the price to ransom us. And some of us see it, some of us don't, but the more that we see it, it changes us. When we discover that the price he has paid has actually purchased for us a place for our hearts to truly find rest, it begins to change us. And it's slow a lot of the time, not all the time, but a lot of the time, more often than I would like it to be. Maybe that's just my own stubbornness or stupidity, but I'm not saying it's not going to go from one dramatic mountain peak to another dramatic mountain peak from day to day, but over time, as we allow God's love to become real in our lives, it changes us. And here's the point I want to leave you with. In this particular story, the one key difference between the first two stories and this third story, it spoke of the lost sheep and the lost coin, and in both cases, the shepherd and the lady went looking for it, searching for it. In this third story of the prodigal son, we don't read that the father went looking for the son. And it's been suggested, now again, it's a parable, so you don't want to overanalyze it, but it's been suggested that the reason for this is because the son wasn't lost. He knew where home was. And he actually needed to come to his senses. And this might sound strange to us, but that's actually how kind God is. God's not going to make us. He's not going to force us. He's not going to control us. He's not going to dominate us. That comes from the other side. Rather, I think that God reveals his love to us, and he extends an invitation. The son had to come to his senses and return home. Even though he thought that return would look different, it would look like he's just going to be a servant or a slave, even though he thought he had to beg and plead and convince and grovel, he still had to come to his senses. And so what I want to leave you with today is just this idea that I believe we have a Father, a heavenly Father, who loves you more than you would dare hope. And he invites us to come home. He allows us to come to our senses. So the only question that is remaining, I guess, depending on, or from person to person, is where are we? Like, where are we right now in our relationship with God? Where are we in our journey with God? And again, there'd be people in very, very different places. But when God asks you a question, I'm not saying God's asking this question, I'm asking the question. But when God asks you a question, like with Adam and Eve, when he goes into the garden looking for them, it's not because he didn't know where they were. When he asked them, where are you? It wasn't for his information. It was for their revelation. It is important for us, even if you don't want to take the next step, I think is really important for us. I think even if you take all Christianity aside, everything that you think this church represents aside, I just think from a human integrity point of view, it's a really good question to ask yourself. Where are you? Where are you in your life? And whether you're in a relationship with God or you're not in a relationship with God, the question would be whether or not we're actually experiencing the fruit of love, the fruit of being loved. Because I do believe that to be loved by God, we experience increasing freedom. To be loved by God, we experience increasing healing from some of the wounds that we're carrying around, in some cases for decades. I think that when we are allowing ourselves to be loved by God, it leads us. He leads us gently to increasing wholeness to where it becomes less about us and more about others, and we can actually love others better, and we can serve others better, and there are fewer and fewer strings attached. We hold on to what we have with a looser grip. We no longer idolize God's purpose for our lives just for our own pure, I guess, ego and need to be needed, which there's nothing wrong with that being the starting point, but I think we can get to a place where, God, it's because I just want to, whatever obedience looks like, my answer is yes. Carte blanche surrender, God. Carte blanche surrender. So I want to invite you to close your eyes for a few moments.